Du Fu, Elegies on Ancient Sites, number 4. The Lord of Shu coveted Wu, coming down the Three Gorges. The next year he died in the Yong'an Palace. On the empty mountains I can imagine his feathered banners. In this ruined shrine I see his glorious palace. Now cranes roost in the cypress by his ancient temple, where only old villagers camp for the summer and winter rites. Zhuge Liang's temple is not far away, where pilgrims honor king and minister together. So we continue with Du Fu. This is the fourth of his Elegies on Ancient Sites, which is included in the 300 Tang Poems collection. As we've mentioned in the previous poems, this collection of verse was probably composed in the 760s, towards the end of Du Fu's life, when he was traveling down the Yangtze River Valley, en route trying to get back to his home in Luoyang, but he would never reach his home. So he's going down the river, spending most of his time with his family, living on a boat, maybe making some stops and settling in some villages or towns for maybe a few days, a few weeks, and then going on. And of course, as any Chinese scholar official would do, when passing through famous landmarks, places in the area of the south which are associated with great figures of the past, the poet would stop there, enjoy the scenery, the sights, and perhaps compose a poem immortalizing what was already an immortal figure. We've already encountered poems of Du Fu honoring especially when he was in the area of Shu, honoring Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang, and we've talked about them previously. At the end of the Han Dynasty, around the year 200 of the Common Era, China, after some periods of civil war and warlordism, got broken up into three big chunks. And this was the period named after those three chunks as the Three Kingdoms, which lasted from about 200 to, let's say, 250, the first half century of the 3rd century of the Common Era, the first 50 years. So this was a period in which, as opposed to a unified empire, the empire was divided into three pieces. The biggest one in the north was ruled by Cao Cao, the warlord, and his son would finally depose the last puppet Han emperor to proclaim his own dynasty, the Wei. So this northern kingdom, centered in the Yellow River Valley, which was the most powerful of the three, is called Cao Wei. Now, in the southeast, in the area of what had been the old Warring States Kingdom of Wu, another of the warlords, Sun Tzu, managed to carve a little state for himself, a statelet, which was the state of Eastern Wu. And in the west, basically in the area of Shu, but also extending to the upper course of the Han River Valley and to the very upper course of the Yangtze River Valley, another state was forged, the last one, which was the state of Shu. Basically, it was centered on the old province of Shu. This was Shu Han. The ruler here was Liu Bei, who was a scion of the Han imperial dynasty, and he was counseled by a very good, very smart warlord and military counselor who became his chancellor and the main commander of his troops, who was Zhuge Liang, who would become legendary in later history for being a master strategist, a very good general, and ended up being deified and worshipped as a god of war. Now, there was a state of balance. Even though the northern state of Cao Wei was the most powerful of the three, a certain balance was maintained, and there were shifting alliances. In one of those alliances, Shu was allied with Wu, and they managed to defeat a much bigger northern Chinese force at the Battle of the Red Cliffs, which became a very famous battle in Chinese history, and stopped definitely Cao Cao's attempts at unifying the country. So this poem, like others by Du Fu, is a homage to Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang. More specifically, this one is more centered on the Lord of Shu, which is Emperor Liu Bei. The next and last poem of the series is centered on Zhuge Liang. Now, Liu Bei was ambitious. He wanted to control more territories than the area of Shu, so he made many campaigns, many of them unsuccessful, to expand territory in the southeast. And in fact, he would die in one of these campaigns, and that is what is referenced in this poem. He died out of the state of Shu in territory which was disputed with the state of Wu, and he was in the place where he died, or in the palace close to where he died. A temple was built to commemorate him. So here we have, in this poem, we have Du Fu probably traveling through the Three Gorges, probably in the whereabouts of the place where the Lord of Shu had died, where his temple was located, and also Zhuge Liang's temple was relatively nearby. Passing through those sites, visiting them, Du Fu composes a poem. So there's a landmark element in this poem, but the main topic, I would say, here is the evocation of the past. Remember also that Zhuge Liang and Liu Bei were very frequently referenced by Tang poets in the aftermath of the Anlushan rebellion. Because there was this idea that the martial times which the Tang dynasty was living required for martial heroes like Zhuge Liang. And there was a bit of a restoration, if you wish, of the Tang dynasty that had almost been toppled by the rebellion, mirroring or echoing that preservation of a last remnant of the Han dynasty and the Liu Bei during the Three Kingdoms. Okay, so having made that introduction, let's take a look at the poem as we usually do, couplet by couplet. So first couplet. The Lord of Shu coveted Wu, coming down the Three Gorges. The next year, he died in the Yong'an Palace. So the poem starts with, as usual in these Chinese poems, by giving us the background. So Elegies on ancient sites is very generic. What ancient site is being referenced here? Well, the Yong'an Palace, the place in, as I say, the upper course of the Yangtze, close to the Three Gorges, where Liu Bei lived temporarily and died after a battle. So the area in which the Shu kingdom was trying to expand and which is now being visited by Du Fu. So the event is referenced in the first line. The Lord of Shu wants to expand territory. He wants to conquer the lands of Wu. He comes down through the Three Gorges, but he's stopped. The next year, after he starts this last of his military campaigns, he suffers a defeat in battle, and from the injuries, he dies in the Yong'an Palace, which would have been the Eternal Peace Palace, I believe. I would have to see the Chinese characters in the original, but Yong'an, it could be Eternal Peace. Rather ironic name for the palace, unless the Eternal Peace be the Eternal Peace of Death. So the second couplet, the first couplet evokes that past glorious event, Liu Bei coming into this territory, dying in it. And now we fast forward, we move to Du Fu's present. What is happening now? Second couplet, on the empty mountains, I can imagine his feathered banners. In this ruined shrine, I see his glorious palace. So there are some traces of that glorious past in the land that Du Fu is visiting. But of course, they are only traces. Du Fu uses those archaeological remains, if you wish, to evoke the glory of the past. And there's also, of course, a contrast, which is very typical in these poems, praising or reminiscing the glories of days gone by. This contrast between the luxurious, opulent, glorious, epic past and the rather plain, simplistic, nature-centered and poor or modest, humble present. So the present is characterized by empty mountains and a ruined shrine. That's all that remains. The mountains are now empty. This is not a very populated area. And the shrine that was probably once new and shiny and splendid is now a ruined shrine. This is a backward area, and not much money is invested anyway in upkeeping of Liu Bei's temple. So there's a contrast, the empty mountains versus the feathered banners. The feathered banners represent, as a metonymy, the glorious army that Liu Bei was heading himself, with all its shine and glory and burnished armors and swords and colorful pennants and flags with feathers flying in the wind. An army on the march. And also what was once a glorious palace where an emperor lived is now, probably it was after his death, reconverted into a shrine or a temple, and is now in ruins, so looking pretty shoddy and dilapidated. So the glories of the past are mainly gone. The third couplet continues in this line. If the second couplet basically showed us geographical landmarks, like or man-made or not man-made, like the mountains and the shrines, which are empty and ruined, the third couplet focuses on the animal presence, animal and human presence, which is also contrasted with what happened in the past. So in this landscape of relative impoverishment, ruin, and relative absence of that glorious past, who dwells now? Not the old armies, not the aristocrats, but the simple people and animals and birds. Now cranes roost in the cypress by his ancient temple, where only old villagers come for the summer and winter rites. So that's the current humble situation. Cypresses were associated with Zhuge Liang and with Liu Bei. But these spaces, which were the courts of the kings of yore, now are only the roosting places of the cranes. The cranes stop in the cypresses, they make their nests there. And who comes out of the human population to the old palace, to the old court? Not courtiers, not aristocrats, not warriors, only the simple villagers, the old villagers that come for the summer and winter rites. So Liu Bei has become a sort of local god with his local shrine, which is subjected to considerable neglect, but he still receives, the sacrifices and rituals at the seasonal occasions of the villagers, as they would pray to any local god of the rivers and the mountains. Finally, the last couplet. Zhuge Liang's temple is not far away, where pilgrims honor king and minister together. So the last couplet is a bit unusual in this series, in that rather than wrapping up and summing up the pathos or the main idea of the poem, it actually seems to be pushing us forward to the next poem on the series, to the poem dedicated to Zhuge Liang and to Zhuge Liang's temple. So this is the Lord of Shu. The Lord of Shu was a good ruler, but of course this emphasis, even in the poem dedicated to him in the last couplet, this emphasis on underlining Zhuge Liang is significant because Liu Bei was not an incompetent ruler. He managed to carve out a state for himself, but it is in the tradition, and of course Du Fu is following it, it is his minister who is to praise. If he hadn't managed to enroll Zhuge Liang in his service, it's doubtful whether Liu Bei would have been so successful. He probably would have been defeated like all the other warlords in the north by Cao Cao. So any reference or any praise of of Liu Bei is implicitly a praise of Zhuge Liang, and here it's made explicit. And of course, scholar officials would feel special empathy for a minister over any ruler, because they patterned themselves on ministers. They wanted to be like Zhuge Liang. They wanted to be successful ministers, dynastic saviors. But no scholar official ever rose to the position of emperor that I know of. So those weren't their models. So Zhuge Liang's temple is not far, and there the pilgrims who visit the temples honor Zhuge Liang, but they also honor the king. They go together, like birds of a feather. And the next poem in the series will be about Zhuge Liang and his temple. So, not a bad poem. It evokes again the landscapes, the landmarks that Du Fu is passing through, and it evokes a glorious past.